So I think we can start now. So welcome to everyone. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to the fourth webinar of the Infectious Hazards Foresight initiative. So I'm Margot Mathis and I'm working for the WHO as part of the core team responsible for this initiative. As you know, this is an initiative that has been recently launched by the WHO to discuss the future of the COVID-19 pandemic and other infectious threats for the next 3 to 5 years. During the last 3 webinars of this series, we have presented the project, what Foresight is, what are the methodology and the practical uses, but we also discussed in depth several of the trends that are shaping our world. During today's webinar, we will discuss the 4 scenarios we have developed using Foresight methodology and expert consultation. Just a quick reminder that these scenarios are not prediction of the future, but they are rather an invitation to understand and to debate about the plausible development of the current pandemic, but also other infectious threats in the next 3 to 5 years. And again, today I'm joined by a wonderful set of panelists to discuss the scenarios. So first, Alexander Alexiou, who you would know by now if you have been watching the first webinar of this series. So Alex is a Foresight strategist at Arup. He works with organizations across virtually every industry to identify and analyze trends, explore future possibilities, and plan scenarios that build resilience for the future. Alex works closely with the WHO, leading the scenario planning exercise about the future of the pandemic and better pandemic preparedness. Welcome back, Alex. I'm also pleased to be joined by Dr. Supriya Besbarua. She's a scientist turned communicator who sees herself as a bridge between science and societies. She has over a decade of experience of working in public health emergencies and will be joining soon the WHO's Department of Global Infectious Hazards Preparedness as a technical officer for science and knowledge translation. Till October 2021, she has been the lead for risk communication and community engagement at the WHO Regional Office for Southeast Asia. She was earlier project manager for the pandemic influenza preparedness framework in that same region. Welcome, Supriya. I'm also very honored to have with us Dr. Carmen Dolea. So she's the unit head of the Secretariat for the International Health Regulation, IHR, in the WHO Health Emergency Program. In this capacity, Dr. Dolea leads efforts to implement provision of the IHR related to the emergency committees and review committees, as well as monitoring IHR compliance in relation to travel and trade measures. Before joining the WHO emergency program in 2015, Dr. Dolea worked across several programs in WHO since late 2001, including health system resilience, health system strengthening, health workforce policies and strategies on education, recruitment, urban, rural, and international mobility of health workers, as well as effective development cooperation through the International Health Partnership. Welcome, Carmen. And last but not least, I'm joined by Dr. Catherine Smallwood. So Kathy is the Senior Emergency Officer for the WHO European region. Since 2010, she has worked for the WHO and has contributed to WHO action in the management of risk associated with a range of biological and chemical hazards. She has also led work on emergency preparedness and response to acute public health events, and in managing WHO humanitarian operation in protracted emergencies. Currently, Kathy is the COVID-19 incident manager for Europe, and she leads emergency response operation for the WHO European region. So welcome to everyone to this webinar. As usual, the webinar will be recorded and you'll have access to the recording and the slides. If you want to interact with our panel, please use the Q&A function of Zoom and we'll try to answer as many questions as we can. And now I'd like to give the floor to Alex, who will present the 4 scenarios. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you very much, Margot. Let me just share my screen and confirm that you can all see it. Can you see my screen? I assume yes. Margot, I think we should work on our opening slides and our opening remarks because every time we keep saying the same things, which is great, but sometimes time is of essence and Yeah, we perhaps steal time from other areas. Anyway, Margot, thanks so much. It is the fourth webinar, so we made it so far. For those of you who are returning after having participated in the previous webinars, welcome back. As Margot said, my name is Alex. I work as a senior consultant in Arab's Foresight team in London. And since June this year, if I'm not mistaken, I'm working closely with Margot and her team in the WHO on a scenario planning exercise to explore the future of the COVID-19 pandemic and other infectious threats in the next 3 to 5 years. For those of you who don't know Arab, we are an independent firm of designers, planners, architects, engineers, consultants, and technical specialists. And we offer a broad range of professional services across all scales and all sectors of the built environment. Arab Foresight is Arab's think tank and strategic foresight consultancy. And our mission is to understand change, identify opportunities, and enable a more sustainable future. As Margot said, in the previous webinars, we touched upon a number of themes and a number of topics. And more specifically, we talked about what is foresight and what are some of the foresight methodologies, what are some of foresight's practical uses, and why foresight is useful, and why foresight is useful in the context of pandemic preparedness, better pandemic preparedness. So this happened in webinar 1, and in webinars 2 and 3, we talked a bit more about trends, about the anatomy of a trend, about why trends are important in the scenario planning process, and also why are they important in imagining the future. In addition, we talked about the 25 trends that we have identified as the ones shaping the future of the COVID-19 pandemic and other infectious threats in the next 3 to 5 years. If you are interested in hearing more about not only foresight, but also the work we did around trend analysis and horizon scanning, please do watch the recordings of the previous webinars. As Marco said, today we're going to talk about the 4 plausible scenarios for the future of the pandemic. And these 4 scenarios are really the pinnacle of this endeavor, right? However, they are not the final outcome. They're not the ultimate outcome, and I will explain in a minute why. But they are what we have been working towards for the past almost 5 months. Before we get into the 4 scenarios, and I'm gonna I'm gonna make a high-level presentation of the 4 scenarios and their key assumptions. I think it is really important to talk about scenarios in general and talk about scenarios as a foresight methodology, and why we as a team in collaboration with the WHO, why we chose to use scenarios for this project. So scenarios are hypothetical yet plausible illustrations of the future. They allow us to be creative, right? They allow us to be imaginative, but at the same time they allow us to maintain adequate levels of plausibility. And I think this is something to keep in mind for the rest of the session. This is something to keep in mind when you hear more about the 4 scenarios. All these scenarios are plausible. They can all happen one way or another. So scenarios include qualitative and quantitative elements. So they're a very good combination as a methodology of both qualitative and quantitative approach and aspect. And they're intentionally applied in multiples to show indeterminacy and possible alternatives. They're not predictions and they're not forecasts. And again, I would like to go back to something that I mentioned during the previous webinars, that in the same way that foresight does not predict the future, but it helps us better understand the future, in the same way, scenarios really don't predict the future, but they showcase plausible chains of cause and effect. In a way, they are an invitation to strategic dialogue. They are a way to think the unthinkable, or perhaps expect the unexpected, as we like to say. But most importantly, they help leaders and decision makers frame their thinking and test and refine strategy and policy options. And this last bullet point is really, really important, especially in the context of this exercise. And I come back to what I said a minute ago about scenarios not being the ultimate outcome of this exercise. The ultimate outcome of this exercise is how we can best use them as leaders, as global leaders, and as decision makers to mitigate the ongoing risks of the COVID-19 pandemic, and also be better prepared for future risks from future infectious threats. So in a nutshell, and for those of you who joined the previous webinars, you're probably familiar with this diagram. Scenarios do help us explore alternative possible futures. And while doing so, they help us understand current systems and current complexity. So again, they are an exercise for the future, but they are very well grounded in the present. I will give you a very, very quick overview of our progress and of our process and methodology. So you know, in a way, how we did it, how we came to the 4 scenarios today. So very quickly, we started, as we start in similar exercises, by identifying the trends shaping the future of the COVID-19 pandemic and other infectious threats in the selected time frame in these next 3 to 5 years. And this is very important as a first step, because this way we can really define the ecosystem within which change and within which the exploration of the future will take place, in this case, the ecosystem of the COVID-19 pandemic. And once we define this system, once we define this ecosystem, then we map the components of this system. We map the trends using a STEEP framework, which stands for social, technological, economic, environmental, and political. And we identify the key factors, right? And the key factors are these trends that are actively impacting the shape of this ecosystem. Once we identify the key factors, then we develop different projections for each key factor. And if you like, projections are mini scenarios within each key factor. And the combination of all these projections essentially gives us the scenarios. So the next step was to outline a series of consistent and plausible scenarios for further refinement. So we ended up with a few, and then we selected 4, the 4 that you will see later in the session. And then we engaged the broad range of experts from a wide spectrum of industries and expertise and sectors. Both experts that are very close to, you know, the epidemiological side, let's say, of COVID-19 as an epidemiological phenomenon, but also experts from other industries that really sit at this outer circle of this ecosystem of change, of the ecosystem of COVID-19, sectors like economy, policy, planning and design, etc. So we asked these experts to really review our scenarios, to refine them, to expand them, and to validate them. After doing that, we developed some indicators, socioeconomic indicators, which is really the quantitative side of scenario planning, as I said before. We crafted the scenario narratives. Really, we added that storytelling element, the more qualitative side of scenario planning, and we produced some visuals that you will see later in this session. But these are all work in progress, so please do keep that in mind as well. This is still a work in progress exercise. This week, we're holding a roundtable discussion on Thursday and another one next week on Tuesday to really discuss the implications of these scenarios, right? And this takes me back to what I said before, that scenarios are just a vehicle, are just a tool to really talk about them in more detail and really figure out what we can do collectively to really mitigate the risks and be better prepared for the future. And once we do this at the end of this month, and if everything goes according to plan, we will communicate the outcomes and then engage a broad range of stakeholders to take the scenarios and really take them to the next step. Just to make this a little bit more visual for you, these are the key factors that we identified. And again, as a reminder, key factors are these trends or drivers that are actively influencing the shape of the ecosystem of change. And this ecosystem of change, again, is the COVID-19 pandemic and other infectious threats in the next 3 to 5 years. We organized our key factors in three main categories. The first category is pathogen and host characteristics, and includes everything from virus transmissibility to variant diversity and susceptibility, new pandemic risk, mortality rate, and so forth. The second category has all to do with public health and social measures. And this category includes key factors like vaccine efficacy and access, public health measures, treatment and prevention options, communication patterns, and so forth. And last but not least, we have the category of the contextual factors, which are, again, as I mentioned before, all these factors that sit and revolve around COVID-19 and they're not directly linked to the epidemiological aspect of the pandemic. Things like human behaviors, human values and opinions, things like technology and healthcare innovation, things like climate change impacts, and factors like conflict and civil unrest. So this gives you an idea of how complex and how multidimensional this ecosystem of change is. And this is a very quick overview of the morphological box, which is the scenario methodology that we are using to develop our scenarios. And again, these are all the projections for some of our key factors. And again, projections are really these alternate futures for its key factor, right? A mini scenario, if you like, for its key factor. And I'll take one example. Let's say, for example, vaccine efficacy and access. The projections for this key factor could be high efficacy widespread access, high efficacy region or country specific access, mixed efficacy widespread access, mixed efficacy region or country specific access, and so forth. And then the combinations of these projections, shown here with blue, gives us essentially its scenario. Now, why the morphological approach and why the morphological box as a scenario planning methodology? We chose that because it enables a higher robustness and transparency of key assumptions for its scenario. The WHO, they're very keen on the process being quite scientific and being quite evidence-based, and we believe that the morphological approach, compared to other approaches like the 2x2 matrix, which some of you might come across in similar exercises, we think that this approach really provides that scientific robustness and that transparency when you choose your key assumptions for its scenario. The morphological approach at the same time enables software-assisted analysis of consistency, and we have used the proprietary software developed by our team to really analyze the consistency of these projections. But the morphological approach is also based on the subjective opinions and choices of the core project team, right? This was very important for us to be able to really fit in with our subjective opinions, but also with the opinions of the experts that really helped us refine and expand these scenarios. The morphological approach only sets a baseline logic, and then the detailed narratives are further developed. And of course, it allows us to use socioeconomic indicators like GDP growth, COVAX distribution performance, or mortality rate, or case numbers, etc., to really support our scenarios with more evidence. Now, the 4 scenarios, the moment that you hopefully all were waiting for. Again, a quick reminder, this is still work in progress. Some of these visuals will be refined for the final version of these scenarios. And one of the titles, and more specifically the title of scenario 1, is changing. So these are our 4 scenarios. Scenario 1, a little happiness, not a little luck. Scenario 2, I love you, I hate you. Scenario 3, heartbreak hotel. And scenario 4, here comes trouble. And scenario 1 is the scenario that we really want to be. This is where we want to be as humanity, as a world. Scenario 2 is more or less our baseline scenario, is where we are today. Scenario 3, it would be good to avoid. And scenario 4, if scenario 4 happens, then things are going to be really, really difficult. Again, a reminder, and as Margot mentioned at the beginning, these scenarios are not predictions of the future, right? At the same time, they're all plausible. And it is not about the accuracy of its scenario, but it is about what's happening, all these different elements within its scenario that we, as humanity and as leaders and as decision makers, can really accelerate or slow down. Now, let's go into a bit more depth for each scenario. I'm going to read you the scenario summary, and then we can quickly go through the key scenario assumptions before going back to our panelists and really getting their first reactions and their view for each scenario. So a little happiness. The pandemic is over and COVID-19 is under control. It is considered endemic, and most of the global population has acquired vaccine-derived or natural immunity. As a result of the measures, policies, and lessons learned during the pandemic, the world has become a greener, fairer, and more equal place, and is much better prepared to face future risks. Now, in this scenario, as you can see from the key scenario assumptions, the virus is less potent, and there is widespread natural or acquired immunity. There are new COVID-19 treatment and prevention options offered at scale globally. Mortality rates are low, and the risk of long COVID symptoms is also low. New pandemics do appear, but they do not become a global health crisis. Our economies recover after a short pause. Nations signed an infodemic treaty to combat misinformation and disinformation, to combat really the infodemic that accompanies the pandemic. Access to healthcare for all is improved. Technological and scientific progress and healthcare innovation are happening at a rapid pace, and the benefits of this innovation are available widespread to many countries and many nations. Climate change mitigation and adaptation are happening at a rapid level, and the world is working as one, and humanity gets on top of the pandemic. So that was scenario one, right? This is the scenario that we really want to, this is where we want to be. Scenario two, I love you, I hate you, closer to what we're experiencing right now. I'm reading again the scenario summary. The virus, through multiple mutations and unpredictable, uncontrolled outbreaks, manages to persist and become part of our lives. Humanity keeps up, but the long-lasting impacts of the pandemic on healthcare systems, economies, and the environment start becoming increasingly visible across the world. Now, in terms of key assumptions for this scenario, there is a protracted pandemic, so the virus really persists and it keeps evolving. Immunity levels really vary depending on age group and health status. Vaccines are again playing catch up, but efficacy levels are high and access is widespread, very similar to what's happening today. Stricter elimination and mitigation measures are implemented globally. Some healthcare systems adapt well to the surges of the virus, but others really struggle, creating a backlog of treatment other than the COVID-19 pandemic. Trust in governments and public institutions varies significantly across different parts of the world. Healthcare innovation is happening at a rapid pace, but the benefits or the diffusion of the benefits is limited to certain nations and regions. Economies worldwide experience a midterm pause, with some of them recovering only partially. Extreme weather events become more frequent, and humanity just about keeps up. Scenario three, Heartbreak Hotel. And you can tell from the color palette and the color scheme that things start becoming a little bit more grim, right? And I'm reading again, scenario summary. The virus has evolved to become even more infectious. Nations across the world react in different ways, and the lack of a global, unified front against the pandemic results in a two-speed world characterized by increased socioeconomic, technological, environmental, and political disparities. In terms of key assumptions for this scenario, the virus evolves to become even more infectious. Human transmissibility levels record new high. New variants emerge continuously, and vaccines lose efficacy. COVID-19 causes a wider symptom range, and wider age brackets are impacted, with long COVID rates increasing. Children, for example, are impacted more severely in this scenario. Diagnostics, surveillance, and tracking, they show really varying degrees of quality and rates across nations. And then healthcare systems globally struggle to keep up with the surge in infections. The infodemic is back, right? And it's again thriving and hard to control. Economies are suffering the consequences of long-term pauses. We have continuous lockdowns, closing and reopening economies, and recessions are now a recurring theme. The fight against climate change is not yielding the expected results, and the pressure to adapt increases. Regional and cross-country cooperation shows inconsistent signs, and there is a selective support and cooperation across nations, countries, and regions. This scenario is characterized by collective failure, right? And again, humanity plays catch up. Last but not least, this is where we definitely don't want to be, right? Because if this scenario comes through, or even if elements of this scenario come through, then things are going to be very, very difficult. I'm reading again the scenario summary. In addition to a worsening COVID-19 pandemic, a new pandemic emerges. Nations are unable to handle the additional burden of a double pandemic. Public health measures are contradictory. National economies collapse. Ecosystem degradation accelerates. Extreme weather events are frequent and intense. Humanity is tired and struggles to manage. In terms of key scenario assumptions, as you all realize, there is another global pandemic that emerges, this time a Zika-like pandemic. Some vaccines are working while others are not, and access depends heavily on where you are in the world. Tropical zones, Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia are the ones to suffer first from the impacts of the double pandemic. Diagnostic, surveillance, and tracking systems struggle to cope with two pandemics happening at the same time. And healthcare systems are left in peril, right? Low resilience and an even growing backlog of treatment. Now, efforts to tackle health inequality and intersectional inequality are severely hindered. Economies experience a protracted global pause, and some of them never recover. Some sectors, economic sectors like aviation and industry, completely collapse. Tackling the climate emergency is no longer at the top of most nations' agendas, right? Most nations have, like other things to worry about, and they completely forget about climate change and the climate emergency. And the wider situation leads to a breakdown of global collaboration, something that is coupled with severe conflict and unrest, and humanity struggles to manage. So again, these are our 4 scenarios, and this is a very high level description of what each scenario really includes. The scenario narratives are much more detailed. If you would like to find out more about the scenarios, please drop me a message. But if you would also like to find out more in terms of the implications of the scenarios and what we can do to really mitigate the ongoing risks and formulate and coordinated response to future pandemic threats, then please do join us in the roundtable discussions happening later this week and next week. We will post some more details in the chat. Registration is free and for all, so please do join us, and we will be discussing more about them again later this week on Thursday and next week on Tuesday. Thank you very much. I would happily answer any questions you have on the scenarios, and I will now pass it back to Margot and our panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex, for the great presentation of these scenarios. Yeah, as you mentioned, some of them are quite scary. So I see there are already 2 questions in the Q&A, so please feel free to ask your question and we'll try to answer as many as we can. Before turning to the other panelists and to give them also a bit of time to reflect on this presentation and to digest the information, Alex, I just want maybe to follow up and ask you one question. So you mentioned that the 4 scenarios are all plausible, but do they have the same probability of occurrence? Or can we act now maybe, and our action today will have an impact on the probabilities of occurrence? Thank you.
Thanks, Margot. That's a good question, and I think, in a way, you answered the question while asking it. So all these scenarios are plausible, right? They can all happen. They have the same probabilities, more or less. But as you said, it is about what we can do to really accelerate one thing or slow down another thing. Accelerate one element of each scenario or slow down another element. Now, these are, we try to make these scenarios as global as possible. But at the same time, we recognize that some of the elements and some of the events of each scenario will probably be a bit more profound and a bit more prominent in certain regions of the world, or even in different parts within the same nation, within the same country. So just to summarize my answer, they're all plausible, but the probability of them happening, as you said, really has to do with how we, what our actions are and what our steps are, and how we accelerate one thing or how we slow down another.
Thank you, Alex. So it's good because today we have also some representatives from different regions of the world, so they can also input about what you have said about some elements being maybe more prominent in some regions. So I'd like to turn over now to the other panelists and ask about their initial reaction to the scenarios. What are really the elements that are striking you in these scenarios? So maybe Supriya first.
Thanks very much, Margot, and thank you very much, Alexander, for that excellent presentation, and very interesting and fascinating. As Margot said, I was a scientist. I'm now a communicator. I've been working on risk communication in the Southeast Asia region for a while. So to me, I see things from a sort of a more science versus people and how they can get together kind of lens. So the first thing I was thinking of is we have 4 scenarios before us. And as you said, the likelihood, the probability of all of them are equal, but how can we, how can we push it so that we find ourselves most likely find ourselves in the first scenario as the most likely one? What can we do? And I feel that perhaps there are 2 things we can look at. Maybe I'll call them the 2 P's. First is people, and the second is partnerships. And I think I'm using those words in the broadest sense, if you like. In CRO, recently we had a lessons learned from COVID regional meeting, and I see there are a couple of my colleagues, including Dr. Ruben Samuel, who led that meeting, and some of the common themes that emerged from that meeting was that we need the importance of the highest level of leadership. We need synergy between resilient health systems and health emergency preparedness. We need more investment in human resources. We need early warning and alert mechanisms and more risk-based approach for PHS and public health and social measures, empowerment of communities, strengthening digital infodemics and digital technology and infodemic management, the benefits of private-public partnerships. These are some of the issues that came up. To me, I think all of them depend on people and partnerships. And why do I say that? Because every aspect of I see things from a risk communication community lens, and I think that every aspect of public health response relies on people. If people at the end of the day want strong early warning systems and strengthened contact tracing, but if you have people who don't report their symptoms for whatever reason, it won't work. You will not have early warning systems or whatever. And that actually happened in COVID. A lot of people didn't report because they were afraid. They were afraid that if they reported and they were taken off to some quarantine somewhere else, and they'd leave their families behind, and who would look after their little child, or they would lose their jobs or all of that. So you need to have people on board. Similarly, public health and social measures are critical and continue to be critical, and was even more so initially when we didn't have vaccines. But say several countries in the region had lockdowns in different ways. For example, in India, early in it was April or May 2020, you had a lockdown with the idea to prevent the spread, have people come in. But what happened was, as restaurants, offices, everything closed, people lost their jobs, and people were also afraid. What is this new thing? Are we all going to die? And they all perhaps felt, in that case, we want to go back to our families. So there was mass internal migration. On the other hand, other countries like Thailand had a more graded lockdown. But there too, people, moved around because, again, they were afraid for their livelihoods. So that has an impact. And then once vaccines arrived, we were in a state, initially there were vaccines, and then there was a shortage of vaccines. And so there was this unique balance of, there was a great demand for vaccines, especially by the young working population, but and there was not enough vaccines. So, but on the other hand, for those who needed the vaccines, who were more vulnerable, like the elderly, there was also hesitancy because they felt we don't need vaccines, we're fine. So, that too makes a difference. So at the end of the day, I think people are important. The other thing I wanted to say is stigma. Initially, we saw a lot of stigma, and people, especially against healthcare workers, and that affected the healthcare system and access to treatment. And so the whole point I'm trying to make is that you have to look at it from the people's perspective and look at how they live their lives. And pandemic is just one of the larger aspects of it. And to them, science is just another approach to be believed, say, you know, like religion, like everything else. So they need to be, we need to have them on board, look at the pandemic from their point of view, which is quite different from the scientific point of view, in order to be able to move forward. The second thing I quickly want to talk about is partnerships, because that's also critical. We have partnerships between communities and the government, partnerships, say, amongst different labs and scientists. That's important. Partnerships digitally, especially for managing the epidemic and other ways. And also public-private partnerships and partnerships with the government, because you're talking about the complex global supply chain with many different aspects. So all those partnerships really need to be strengthened. So those are my views, that, you know, two aspects to take into account: people and partnerships. Opa.
Many thanks, Supriya. Really interesting. Yeah, people and partnership. We need both. Maybe allow me just a quick follow-up question. So, as a science communicator, how do you ensure that we have people on board? How do we ensure that we understand how they live, so we can maybe adapt our public health and social measures? Thank you.
Thanks, Margot. I think the most important way is to listen and to engage those who people trust. And when I say people, it's not a homogeneous group. I mean, there are multiple factors there. Even the people that the communities trust, for example, community health workers or the faith leaders, they don't always understand the science, and perhaps if they understood it better, it could be, you know, it could percolate better to the people. You have community health workers who are reaching out, telling people what to do, but most of them are not scientists, whether it's the village health volunteers in Thailand, or it's in this region where we have ashas in India. They're just ordinary people, often women, not always. Female health volunteers in Nepal. So they are the first point of call. Faith leaders continue to be, you know, very strong influencers of community. Since people see science as something to be believed, it's almost like, you know, an alternate religion. If we have faith leaders on board and show that it's not really, you know, science and faith can go hand in hand. It doesn't not necessarily have to be contradictory. Maybe that could help. Listening, understanding people's lives and what drives them, because at the end of the day, it's not just about people need to live their lives, even if when there's a pandemic, their everyday lives. So understanding what motivates them would be important.
Thank you very much, Supriya. So yeah, listening to people, understanding their motivation, but also trying to engage with leaders, community leaders who people trust and who can relay the messages. Thank you. So now I'd like to turn over to Carmen for her initial reaction to the scenarios.
Thanks very much, Margot, and hello, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone, as we say these days. Thank you for the opportunity. I must apologize from the start because I didn't have much time to prepare and to go through the scenarios as such. But listening into the conversation, to the presentations, and thanks very much, Alexander, for your introduction. I can see that the scenarios and the assumptions look at the virus, at the biology, at the clinical impact of the virus, a little bit about the measures that are taken to address the pandemic, a little about, also related to the economy, the impact on economy and how the economy responded. It looks to external factors such as climate change, and it looks at technology as well. And I wonder within these elements or assumptions of the scenarios, whether a place could be foreseen for the legal aspects, in particular, because I am in the IHR, and it's not to pledge or make a pitch for the IHR, but really it's the instrument that basically provides the obligations and the rights of countries and of WHO in managing an event like that. And I'm saying this because there are elements that we've seen in the implementation of the IHR, the expectations that we had that countries would follow the provisions. But one element that struck us in this pandemic is that one key issue of the IHR, which is the protection or so the measures do not unnecessarily interfere with international traffic or trade. At the beginning, there were recommendations under the IHR not to interfere with international traffic or trade or to align these measures to the public health risk. But what we've noticed is that the measures that countries have put in place accumulated or raised in numbers and intensity once the word pandemic has been used. So the linkages between the measures, the response measures, and the use of the word pandemic were clear. However, what is not clear is the legal baseline for this, because the only legal baseline for implementing measures currently is within the IHR and within the provision of this legally binding tool for all the countries. There are clear temporary recommendations that are provided following the declaration of the public health emergency of international concern. There's no definition of a pandemic, and there's no linkage to any action that countries should take when a pandemic is declared. Yet what we have seen is this almost exponential growth in the number of measures and the number of countries that implemented travel-related measures in relation to the pandemic. So this is something that I think we need to just get our heads together and try to incorporate somehow into the discussion and into the thinking, because there's clearly a distinction between a pandemic and the public health emergency of international concern. There's clearly an understanding and an acknowledgement that pandemic is not only about health issues. This is the second part of it. So we've seen that oftentimes decisions were taken not only based on science or evidence or triggered by health concerns, but oftentimes by political rationales behind it. So we need to also be conscious and aware of the political economy, the political implications when we consider scenarios for getting out of the pandemic or for trying to respond to it. And linked to that, it's also the issue related to the trust of people into the government authorities, the trust of authorities into the science, and the ability of the scientists to push for the science behind the measures. This is a link. I think we need to understand that there is an issue related to trust here. And my last point, and linked to that also, we say that measures are supposed to be based on evidence, are supposed to be based on scientific rationale and principles and so on. But we really need to look at more transparency and more clarity in sharing the information, in sharing data, in looking at the quality of the data based on which we do scenarios. That is a key element as well. And the last point is, it was alluded at the beginning, but as we look at the assumption, I think we need to understand what drives the probability of each assumption, not only whether the assumption per se or the scenarios are plausible, but among the assumptions, which are the factors that driving the probability of that assumption becoming a fact or a reality, and try to address that from that angle and try to understand what can we use to for example, better understand the behavior of the viruses from a biology and research perspective, better understand the way measures are implemented in countries based on a social contract and the political contract between authorities and their citizens. So try to understand for each assumption what drives its probability of becoming truth. And obviously, at least at global level, one of the things is the need for global coordination, the need for more access to, or more equitable access to countermeasure, and that cannot be done without a collaboration and coordination of partners. The need for better preparedness, for more money to get into preparedness and easily accessible and easily dispersed to countries in need. So I think just to end on that thing, the scenarios would need to be, or we need to be conscious of the implications, not only of the clinical, biological, economical, or environmental aspect, but also legal issues, social contract, political aspects, and so on and so forth. So fascinating discussion. Happy to continue the conversation and happy to answer any question. Over to you, Margot.
Thank you very much, Carmen. Very good points about, the transparency, the trust, the politicization sometimes of responses, but also all the political and economical aspects that are driving the pandemic. And just to reassure you, I mean, these aspects are really well taken into consideration, political aspect, but also governance issue, the public health arena, architecture. It's really factors that we are taking into consideration to shape these scenarios, because we know they are really big drivers. Maybe also just a quick follow-up question, because many people in our audience are not public health specialists. And if you can just explain in 2 minutes, what are the IHR? What is the role of the IHR? What are the obligations, very briefly, for countries and for WHO? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Margot. I didn't want to start with that, but I think it's because I thought might bore people to that. But anyway, since you asked me now, so IHR, International Health Regulations, is a legally binding instrument of international law that all countries are obliged to comply with. So it provides, its scope is really to prevent, detect, and respond to public health events with risk of international spread, while at the same time minimizing the unnecessary interference with international traffic. It contains obligation for countries to put in place preparedness, capacities to prepare, and so to put in place capacities to detect, prevent, and respond to public health events. So these are the core capacities related to surveillance, laboratory, human resources, health system strengthening, and so on and so forth. So these capacities, all 196 member states or signatories of the IHR have agreed to have them in place. And these are measured and reported on regularly, annually to WHO. The other obligation is for countries to report to WHO events that may constitute a public health emergency of international concern, according to an algorithm that takes into account the risk to human health, the risk of international spread, and the risk of interference with international traffic. Another obligation when it comes to measures related to traffic, to international traffic, if countries put in place such measures, they have the obligation which go beyond what is recommended by WHO. Countries are obliged to inform WHO about these measures, and so the measures have to be scientifically based, of short duration, regular review, not more than 3 months, and so on and so forth. On the WHO side, the obligation is to convene an emergency committee under the IHR to assess the risk of an event and to determine whether the event constitutes a public health emergency of international concern. And if it does constitute, then WHO, following the advice of the emergency committee, issues a set of temporary recommendations, which are defined in the IHR as non-binding advice to countries to respond to the event. And then then also another obligation of WHO is to share the information that we receive from member states immediately, so that they can about events, so that countries can prepare for the response. So in a nutshell, there's lots to do, but one key element of the IHR, which is an issue that have been identified by many reviews, is that there is no mechanism to enforce compliance with the IHR. It is a legally binding instrument, but through the negotiations of member states when they agreed to it in 2005, there is no actual formal mechanism to ensure compliance other than the regular reporting on implementation through the World Health Assembly. And this is something that is being discussed currently by member states on how best to move ahead with this, and whether there would be benefits of having a more global instrument, such as a treaty, to strengthen the implementation and compliance with the IHR. So I'll stop here. I'm happy to answer any questions. Over to you, Margot.
Thank you, Carmen. I think it was really helpful because there is a lot of misunderstanding about what are the IHR. And as you mentioned, a lot of discussion are ongoing right now about the role of the IHR, if we need a revision, if we need a pandemic treaty, etc. So it was good to have an overview from the person in charge. Thank you, Carmen. So now I'd like to hand over to Kathy for her initial reaction about the scenarios. Over to you, Kathy.
Thanks, Margot, and thanks, Carmen, Supriya, and Alexander for kicking off the discussion. And it's great to see such different perspectives because this is really complex, and it's hard to know how to come into this discussion and where to go with it. But I think my initial reaction, I mean, it's fantastic to have this discussion and to kind of try and extract yourself from the here and now and think a little bit about what might be in the future, and some things that with COVID specifically that I often get asked, and as WHO staff we always get asked, is when will this pandemic be over? And what I always respond is that the only thing we can be sure of is that all of our predictions will turn out to be not true. And I think that's characterized this pandemic so far as its total unpredictability, both at the local level, at the regional level, and at the global level, that there are things that have happened that a year ago we wouldn't have expected. A year ago, we still really weren't talking about variants and the possibility of immune escape variants in the same way as we're talking about it and seeing it to some extent now. So maybe thinking about it a bit in the context of this discussion, that question is like, when will the pandemic be over? Maybe when the unpredictability of it gets taken away, and when we can start to move and shift the direction away from always kind of being behind to being a bit ahead of the curve. And we always talk about being ahead of the curve, but maybe we need to delve into that a lot more through these different scenarios. And then the other thing is, how will we respond to the next big threat? And Carmen's talked a lot about the sort of governance, the global architecture that certainly needs to be strengthened, and the core pieces of that took us to some way to where we are now, but then need to be strengthened further to make sure that all of these things that have come across during the pandemic, the inequities, the lack of power under the IHR for us to really do things that we would have liked to have done differently. And something here that I think we really need to kind of think about is we can't keep on doing the same things expecting the different result. And that's something that I think also we need to unpack much more in the context of these scenarios. So often when it comes to pandemic preparedness and response, we go through this kind of cycle of kind of forgetting about it and then coming back to the same problems time and again. And now I think we don't have any excuse anymore, and we really need to look at what needs to change. So what needs to change, and I'm really thinking from the WHO Europe perspective, which is of course a very broad geographic area covering Western Europe, but also Central Asia and Turkey and other countries, and Russia, big countries. And I think there are several things that need to change. And I'm not going to go into the global governance structure that Carmen did, but I think that that's a key kind of assumption that we need to have an improvement there. But in terms of the virus, we need to really move from chasing it to anticipating it. And I think these are the things, and I saw one of the questions in the Q&A is how do we move towards the more optimistic futures, right? So we need to get better at anticipating the changes in the virus itself. That we've come a long way, but there's still a long way to go. We need to change the way I think that we get into the population aspects and the people aspects, and Supriya went into that a long way. And I think we need to move away from combative or fatalistic kind of relationships with different population groups to really captivating the power that people have. And that's also going to help us move towards these more optimistic. We can't do anything without the engagement. And when I think about Europe at the moment, I think of oh dearism, like we're just like, oh no, not another bad news about the pandemic, but we don't really care anymore because we don't want to hear it. We just want to forget about it. And a lot of people have done so much already to contribute to the pandemic in a positive way that we need to keep them involved and we need to keep their kind of commitment up. And that's really key. And then in our response systems, when I think about the way the European region, countries in the European region, even the countries that are doing well at the moment, we're still in a reactive mode. We're not preventing. We haven't moved from that reactive response. We're still kind of taking measures too late, and we've come to the end of our sort of feeling of we've done all of the improvements that we can. We've invested so much in our contact tracing systems, in our laboratory systems, and we can't do any more. So now we're just going to hope for the best and then respond when things get really bad. And I think we need to again move away from that and to really kind of how do we prevent this pandemic from having any of these impacts? So I guess I'm thinking about it in those broad areas. And then there were a couple of things that I wanted to unpack in the scenarios. And I don't know if it's the right time to do it, but I just want to pick out a few of the assumptions on the good side and on the bad side. So, you know, in the first scenario, Alexander, you mentioned a couple of things. One of them, you know, long COVID, low risk of long COVID. And well, we already have long COVID very much present in our populations, creating massive issues there that somehow are not yet really fully understood, the extent, the reasons, the disease itself. And I think I really like the point about stigma. And if we go into a good scenario number one, it's not only about not a lot of risk of long COVID, but also that those people who have long COVID are not stigmatized for it, because that's something that people who have had to take time off work, people who have really suffered, that they're not stigmatized in future. And there's large numbers. And how would that happen? So I don't have these answers, but these are, I guess, the questions. The other positive side of the first scenario is access to healthcare for all is improved. And this I see as a major question mark around, do we really take advantage of this opportunity, this transformative opportunity we have around increasing access to healthcare and changing those systems? We've seen in COVID-19 the importance, as other people said, of early reporting of symptoms, early presentation to primary healthcare, early interventions in terms of treatment. Are these things going to happen? Are we going to really change the long-term care settings, these care infrastructures that have remained outside of the health system? Are we going to really make those changes that are needed to bring long-term care of older populations, people who have very specific needs, vulnerable groups, into the health system and have them as well trained, as well equipped, as well funded as some of the other parts of our health infrastructure? I think these are things that are really, if those changes are made, and a lot of this comes from the lessons learned, then we can move ourselves towards this scenario number one. In terms of moving on, scenario number two, I just wanted to flag the issue around vaccines. And Alexander, you spoke a lot about the efficacy of the vaccines and the access. From my perspective, talking about the European region, we need to think broader than that, because in a lot of countries in the European region, we have effective vaccines and we have access to vaccines. That has not solved the major issues around getting those systems in place to make sure that people who need them can really access them, i.e. the outreach is there. That the health systems not only say to people, you can come and get your vaccine from this center here, but they're reaching out and they're getting to those people who really need the vaccine the most. But then the other component, and it's a big one, is the acceptance issue. So moving very much away from vaccine skepticism to the acceptance of vaccines. And that is a major challenge, because we're seeing it now with vaccines, the first generation of vaccines, where I think the writing is on the wall. There's so much information to share that this is the right way to go. If we're then moving 5 years ahead, where we're third generation vaccines, people might have got lost in it, and really that's something that we really need to put quite a lot of effort into, and the European region is going to be one of the regions where I believe that we're going to see the biggest challenges there. We've seen it with routine vaccination programs, and we'll see it with these with COVID-19 as well. And then as things get worse, we're talking about failures of the diagnostic surveillance systems, and there we've seen big failures in the past 2 years. We've seen big black spots, and these are the areas that if we continue to not make changes in improving the reporting, the detection, the public health measures, then we're going to continue to veer towards the negative scenarios. In the European regions, we also have a number of black spots. Some of them are member states themselves that we don't have very good information about. Sometimes it's because the country doesn't have the systems in place or the capacities in place, but sometimes it's other reasons. We have many contested areas, subnational areas that are contested, where we don't have the regular reporting systems in place. Eastern Ukraine, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Transnistria, all of these places that represent areas that we just don't really know what's going on. And that's something that we'll need to solve one way or the other, because as we've seen, as the virus continues to circulate, and if the responses and the countermeasures are not available, a change in the virus anywhere can then undermine the global response. So I think, yeah, those are the kind of things that I wanted to highlight. And the final thing, which is the kind of scenario of another pandemic or another threat, I see that already slowly emerging in Europe. What we've seen with seasonal viruses that are circulating aseasonally. We've seen it with a common childhood respiratory virus, RSV, many of you will know it. And we've seen hospitals full, pediatric wards full of children hospitalized. We're also worried about flu. And I think that's something that is a very likely future, which is we'll have a very serious season of flu, and that might affect many countries at the same time. And that's also very, very hard to manage. We're already talking about a twindemic in the European region and trying to avoid that from happening. But these are all parts of these scenarios are all kind of happening now, but it's really up to us to kind of push them towards the sort of 1 and 2 rather than 3 and 4. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Katie. Really interesting views and rich inputs from the European region. It's important, I think, to stress the diversity of this region, because when we speak about Europe, you usually think about well-developed countries that have capacity to manage such events, and you see this is not the reality in many instances. So maybe I'd like to to react on one thing that you mentioned, and which relates to pandemic fatigue, the so-called pandemic fatigue. And you mentioned how to keep people engaged, to respond to the current pandemic. And I think it relates also to the comment you mentioned in the Q&A. So the comment about so far, actually, all optimistic assumptions turn out to be wrong. However, those optimistic scenarios reach out the public, and most people turn away from prevention measures. We have seen that in Western countries. So do you think we can somehow influence the public to use the prevention measures to bring back the optimist scenarios into life? So thank you, Kathy.
I don't know if I can respond to that question, and I would love for the other panelists to give their views, but certainly, I mean, that's definitely the way to go. And how can we do that? A lot of it, I think, is removing this extremism, right? From, no, we're doing nothing, everything's fine, the pandemic's over, let's go back to normal life, to 2 months later, oh dear, now the situation is so bad that we're going to enter into this lockdown. And we've got this kind of flip-flop from pretending everything's fine to actually understanding that everything is totally awful, and that the burden has kind of disruption, not only the morbidity and the mortality, the direct, but the disruption to society, even in highly vaccinated communities, becomes very, very significant when the virus just kind of rampages through the population. So I think bringing us back to something that's more measured, where we're not having these extreme fluctuations, where people see predictability, people see that, in fact, the measures that are being put in place help us avoid a deterioration of the situation. And I think maybe we need to get better, and the public health community needs to get better at explaining or communicating with populations and getting them to really buy into this approach, where we understand that all of the actions that we're taking are actually going to mitigate any deterioration in the future. And we need to really invest everything in lifting the burden of the pandemic on on our populations. And that means lifting the burden economically, as well as in the sort of on the healthcare system. And I think, yeah, just basic early interventions, smaller interventions, recognizing the role that everyone has to play is going to be the way that people are able to accept and to buy into the measures that are in place, use them, knowing that they're contributing to the better good and to avoiding any further restrictive measures to be put in place, which needs to be recognized and put forward as kind of our major objective here. We as public health officials are not for lockdowns. I think that's a common misconception, and we need to do everything available in our power to avoid that.
Thank you, Katie. So yeah, improve the predictability of the public health and social measures. Maybe Carmen, you want to react to that, because you mentioned that a lot of the decisions that are made, are politically influenced. So how can we improve the predictability of the measures to ensure that the burden on the population is the lower possible?
Yeah, thanks, Margot, and thanks, Katie. These are really difficult questions, but as we discussed, I think one of the things that would build the trust in this social contract between the population and their authority is consistency, transparency, and clarity of the messages. If we continue to provide solid evidence-based approaches, and we're not changing what we are saying or not we, I mean, if the advice is not changed from one time to another, acknowledging the massive unknowns that we have started off with in this pandemic. At the beginning, we didn't know much about it. And it's acceptable a level of tolerance that allows for the unknowns. But the more we go into this and the more we learn about the virus, the measures, the therapeutics, the diagnostic, and the vaccines, the more clarity and consistency we should be able to provide in our messaging, so that this trust is maintained and is built between the population and the authorities. Because if we don't maintain the social contract, as Katie said also, there's no justification in coming back with a measure that proved there's no didn't provide any positive outcomes. So if we build on the successes, if we build and acknowledge and present clearly what has worked, why it has worked, and how we can continue to make it work consistently and transparently, that's basically our bread and butter as public health professionals, to be consistent and transparent and evidence-based in what you're saying, and acknowledging that there is a level of tolerance that we need to accept, tolerance of risk, tolerance of the unknown, tolerance of measures that may need to be taken for a shortened period of time. It's a long haul, but we've learned so much, and we continue to learn about it. But being consistent, I think it's one of the key elements of building the trust as well. Over to you, Margaret.
Thank you, Carmen. So yeah, building the trust is also a lot about how do we communicate risk. So here I'd like to hand over to our risk communication specialist, Supriya. And maybe Supriya, you can tackle the issue from the angle of the youth. How do you engage the youth groups in communicating the messages? Because the youth are the ones that are really involved and present on social media. And we see social media sometimes as a problem because a lot of misinformation circulates. But we can also use, I think, the social media as a tool to really relay the good messages. So over to you, Supriya.
Thanks, Margot, and thanks, Carmen, as well, for that very good point. It's a very important point that you've made, that developing communicating clearly and consistently. But we at the same time, we also need to keep in mind that people don't really always understand why there is uncertainty in things. So we also need to communicate what we mean by evidence, and why we feel that evidence is important, and why, what the process is, so that it's not just that here is the evidence, believe it. And the second point that you made about communicating effectively with youth, as you know, it's the youth live in a different world, and again, also with youth, there's a wide variety. Most of them are on social media and on changing apps, and their whole interaction with society is different. So we have to meet them on their terms and understand which platforms they go to, how they communicate. But they are also a part of society. So we also, at the same time, look at what's influencing them in an offline manner as well. So it's a combination of both offline and online. And also, there are, while most of the world is connected digitally and the number of connections are increasing, it's an interaction between people. What you see online is also spread offline when people connect with each other, talk to each other. So just online is not the only way. We also at the same time have to talk through more traditional channels, like talk to people who talk to young people, such as teachers, such as also people that the youth idealize, influencers both on social media and non-social media, often such as sports heroes and other people, in for example, South Asia, cricket is a big thing, and there are cricket matches going on. So people who idealize sports stars and all of that, we need to reach out to them as well. We need to also look at different platforms that like TikTok and all that, where you have a lot of young people coming up as stars, so interact in various ways, in other words. So it's in other words, what I'm trying to say is, while we need to keep abreast and be really quick and engage on social media platforms, we also need to look at youth in the context of the overall sort of society they live in, which is both online and offline, and work on it simultaneously.
Thank you, Supriya. Really interesting points. So I'd like to shift a little bit the focus of the discussion and turn back to Alex now, because Kathy, you mentioned that the unpredictability of this current pandemic and the need really to get ahead of the curve. So Alex, how do you see foresight being used by decision makers to make better, more informed decision? And do you know if this kind of approach are already used systematically in some sectors to really help us to make the right decisions?
Good question again, Margot, and a hard one, I think. I'll start from the second part of the question. Foresight thinking and foresight as a theory and as a practice is gaining traction, I think, from what I at least observe in the last maybe couple of decades. The UK government has a foresight unit. I know the European Parliament has a foresight unit, the global trend analysis unit. But I think that like in other sectors, like the insurance sectors, I think they employ a lot of foresight methodologies and techniques and foresight thinking, and really, like kind of increasing this more forward-looking approach to their business. But I think what is tricky is what you just mentioned in the first part of the question: how do we translate foresight thinking into action, right? How do we make sure that, like foresight thinking and foresight approaches and foresight methodologies and foresight exercises like the one that we are doing right now about the future of the COVID-19 pandemic really fit into strategies, right? I don't think I have an answer for that. And I think what we're doing right now together, I think it's going to be a very good testament and a very good test, right? So how do we take all that? And I've made so many notes based on what all the speakers said, because what you just all described, Carmen, Catherine, and Supriya, are all the things that we should be talking about to really make these scenarios a bit more actionable and translate the scenarios into actions and strategies, both at all levels, right? From the global to the regional to the local, I guess. I think quick answer, Margot, I don't know. I think, just to give like a bit of a personal perspective here, it's sometimes these things sound better than they are, and like we are very good at talking about like being ahead of the curve and adopting this forward-looking mindset and forward-looking attitude and in what's to deal with what's coming, but I guess like making that practical and translating it into something practical is still an issue. And I think a lot of this, like has to do with the political aspect of, like kind of policy making and policy design and policy implementation. So I think it is part of a wider mindset shift that needs to happen, like across all, let's say, levels and of governance and decision making. But yeah, I think it is a good question for us. It is a good challenge for the team, right? For the WHO and ARUP teams to see what we can do with the scenarios once we finish the project. And again, there have been examples in the past of like building scenarios and then in a way taking them and applying them in some sort of simulation exercise. So what we do here can easily be taken and it can be implemented or tested on a city level, for example, right, where we deal with a with a real life scenario. choose one of the 4 scenarios, and then we take it into, a city level, and we bring all stakeholders together, and in a way we assess, the preparedness and the response, and again from there we really identify what needs to be done, and hopefully we translate that into something that's actionable in terms of policy and strategy and actions that really target certain sections of this equation and this endeavor.
Thank you, Alex. So no pressure at all. Huh? But yeah, no, I agree with you. I mean, it's super nice to have interesting discussion on these topics, but then we need some action and we need some concrete recommendation to countries. And so this is a global exercise, but maybe one of the solutions is also to go to the region, to go to countries specifically to get their context and to really implement local solutions. So we are almost over with time now. So I'd like to hand over one last time to all of our panelists for some final words, some key away messages. And if you have also some recommendation for our panelists that will be present during the roundtables to discuss the implication of these scenarios, we are really happy to hear about them. So over to Carmen for the final messages.
Thanks very much, Margot and Alex and the colleagues, panelists and listeners. And thank you for the nice words that you put in the chat. We're happy to hear that you like what we are saying, and we like that you agree with these key issues. So as I said, I think just as a summary, as we move towards with the scenarios, I think we need to look at whether we have addressed or included all the relevant elements that have to be part of the scenarios. Are we missing any of them? We talk about politics, we talk about legal aspects and so on. Then look at the assumptions and try to understand the drivers of these assumptions, the factors that might increase their likelihood to become reality, do it systematically. Be consistent and transparent in our communication. And my last word is basically to link all of this. It's a famous quote that most of you probably have heard from Virchow, which said that medicine is a social science and politics is nothing more than medicine on a grand scale. I think this basically sums up what we are talking about here. And the level of tolerance of some kind of uncertainty is part of the equation as we move ahead with these scenarios. Over to you, Margot, and thanks again for the opportunity. I really enjoyed the session.
Thank you, Carmen. Really good points. So now over to Supriya for any final words.
Thank you, Margot. I'd like to thank all of you actually, because it's been a very interesting discussion, and you know, I feel like I've completely sort of feel recharged and re-energized looking at the future, so to say. My final words would be that just we have to keep the people in mind. People's thoughts, feelings, and their lives ultimately will drive what they will do, and therefore how any event will move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Supriya. A good, strong message here. We need to keep the people in mind. So, Katy, any final words?
Just to recognize I think the tremendous force for good that we've actually seen in the response to COVID-19. And I think that's the most powerful tool for keeping the momentum in a more positive way. And I think we can do more to rather than focus on the bad, really highlight the good. I think that would be something key. And then the second thing, and this is something that we in the European region are really doing with our country offices and with countries, is to identify the innovation, the real innovation that we've seen during this pandemic, identify it, capture it so that we can finance it, we can institutionalize it where it needs to be institutionalized, and then sustain it, because that is going to be what makes the change next time. If we lose all of the good that we've done over the past 2 years, we will fail the next time in the same way as we did. But if we can capture the innovations of the pandemic, then we actually stand a really good chance of doing better next time.
Thank you, Cathy. So yeah, captures innovation to sustain it and focus on the good. I like this message. Alex, any final words?
I would like to build on what Catherine said, and Margot, I'm sure you remember that this was another recurring theme during our workshops, right? I mean, when we engaged with the experts from a variety of industries, there was this consensus of science will not fail us. You know, like we know, we know the science. What might fail us is, like that human response that's not going to be. It's not going to rise up to the expectations. So back to what Catherine said, I think it is really important to treat the COVID-19 pandemic as a global human experience. And I think it is in our hands to really decide if this experience will bring us together and unite us or divide us, right? So with that, yeah, let's leave it here. I mean, I think a lot of this will be discussed further on Thursday and on Tuesday during our roundtables, Margot. So yeah, again, thank you all so much. That was a fascinating discussion. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. I'm an optimistic, so I hope this will unite us. So I'd like to thank everyone for the great discussion today and the great contribution. So as Alex mentioned, we'll have the 2 roundtables. So one this Thursday and the other one next Tuesday. So we'll discuss the implication of each scenarios, but also the key action we need to implement now in order to improve pandemic preparedness. And you'll be able to interact with the panelists through Q&A and through polls. So I really encourage you to register, and I think you should have the link to register in the chat. So on our last webinar of this series will be held on December the 10th, and we will present the recommendation for the future of the pandemic preparedness. This recommendation will also have informed the discussion of the special session of the World Health Assembly that will take place at the very end of the month. So I thank you, everyone, and I wish you a good rest of the day. Talk soon. Bye-bye.